There has been an unrecognized earthquake in presidential election polling. I'll get to Trump's trial and how he managed to blow it and why he thought a guy celebrating his 40th year of no longer being on Saturday Night Live was just the right choice to lead his courthouse posse yesterday. I'll get to that in a moment. But first, I think a series of lights may have gone off over the heads of a series of voters. And not to sound like one of those British generals who believed he could end World War I by Thursday, if only they could take the Somme by nightfall with less than 1 million casualties. But I think we may actually be seeing the start of the breakthrough, the voter breakthrough against Trump. This was Joshua Green writing for Bloomberg, and don't let his mixture of nonchalance and utter surprise infuriate you. Just listen. Quote, as the rematch between Joe Biden and Donald Trump draws nearer, political professionals are detecting an unusual concern among some undecided voters that if Trump returns to the White House, he'll refuse to step down when his term is up. Oh, no kidding? Is that a thing? Wow. Go on. Seiji Carpenter, vice president at David Binder Research, noticed this fear in early April while conducting focus groups of people who had voted for Biden in 2020 but became disillusioned and were considering switching sides. Quoting him, we were talking to Latino men and Asian American Pacific Islander women in battleground states, and they went straight to the issue of, what if Trump won't give up power? It's not something we'd been testing for, but what we've seen so far indicates a real concern there. So, Mr. Carpenter, this is something new, you say? Just because he started doing his quote jokes about never leaving office in like February of 2017. You haven't been asking about this just because we all think that he has a Banana Republic military uniform with the Vietnam medals he's awarded himself already pinned on it. You have not been asking this question? 10 years he's been a Democratic focus group puller, according to Bloomberg, this Mr. Carpenter. Republican strategists, the article goes on, have encountered the same thing. It's showing up in our focus groups, says Sarah Longwell, the chief executive of Longwell Partners and publisher of the conservative website The Bulwark. It happened just the other day. Longwell shared a video of a group of undecided swing state voters who had been asked if they were worried that Trump might violate the constitutional amendment, limiting him to one more term if he wins in November. Does anybody think he may not abide by the 22nd Amendment of the Constitution and leave office after the 2028 election? Anyone worried about that? The moderator asked. In response, 7 of the 8 participants raised a hand, unquote. Wait, for or against? Wait, this is the earthquake. Quote, a Pennsylvania man worried that Trump might go further and try to institute a dynasty. Quoting him on this tape, I wouldn't put it past him now that he owns the RNC, the man said. To say Don Jr. is going to do the next term and he'll get 2, and then Barron will get 2, and we'll just have some fake monarchy. As far-fetched as it may sound, Mr. Green goes on, the prospect of Trump overriding or simply ignoring the constitutional provision that limits a president to serving 2 terms seems to be pushing some undecided voters toward Biden. Yes, it's far-fetched. The guy who wrote this article wrote a book about Liz Warren, Bernie, and AOC, and he has written this article like the next paragraph will start, you may not believe this, but the kids now think maybe the Earth goes around the sun. Quote, Trump's flirtations with smashing limits on presidential power, while thrilling to many of his followers, alarm other voters. including some who once supported him. Lori McCammon, a grandmother in Alma, Wisconsin, voted for Trump in 2016, but says she recoiled at his recent comments and won't be supporting him in November. She says she's worried that Trump won't cede power if he's reelected. Quote, based on what I've heard from him and figures like Steve Bannon, McCammon says, this would be our last free and fair election. In other words, in this Wisconsin grandma's house, they don't think Trump is joking about never leaving office just because he had the American Conservative magazine publish a piece saying that the two-term limit shouldn't apply to non-consecutive terms and doesn't apply to them. All right, back to Bloomberg. Quote, strategists and pollsters say that much like McCammon, many uncommitted voters don't perceive Trump's language to be jesting or ironic, nor do they view a potential power grab as a joke. I'm not alone. I'm not alone. When we ask about his record on democracy, there's a lot of general concern, even among Republicans, about what a second Trump term might be like, says Brian Bennett, a pollster with Navigator Research, a Democratic-aligned firm. Unease among non-Democratic voters is also evident in public surveys, Bloomberg says. A recent Quinnipiac poll found that 21% of independent voters and 8% of Republicans indicated that preserving democracy in the United States was the most critical issue facing the country. As an aside, every poll asks now for the top issue for voters. That often is not the same as the issue which voters say is actually the one on which they will decide their vote. Most of these polls also don't list second choice or third choice among most important issues, and very often that is the preservation of democracy, although the Republican definition of that and the Democratic definition of that may not match exactly. But Mr. Green of Bloomberg has added something to this that is actually new. And again, I quote, several political professionals who talk to voters for a living say they've detected a fundamental shift in the way people view Trump's motivations and intentions as compared with other politicians. Quote, typically, when we raise concern about a candidate's agenda, people are skeptical and want to do their own research first or think it's an attack, says Carpenter, the Democratic Focus Group director. With Trump, that's not true. Voters believe that he would try to remove term limits, and they're nervous about what's possible. Carpenter's conversations with uncommitted voters have led him to believe that beyond January 6 and Trump's inflammatory comments, this shift owes a great deal to a less obvious catalyst. Are you ready? The less obvious catalyst is the Supreme Court. Quote, the dimensions of what constitutes a credible threat have expanded because of Roe, Carpenter says. Since that decision, you hear voters talking themselves out of the notion that an idea is too far-fetched. Hallelujah! Hallelujah! Thank you! Somebody is listening to me! One assumes that all the groundwork for this story for Bloomberg was done before Mr. and Mrs. Alito answered comedian Eddie Izzard's rhetorical question, do you have a flag? It does give an answer to a very practical question Democrats are shrinking from asking. What should we do to Alito now? Senator Dick Durbin is saying, no hearings? No, of course not. And is simply again asking politely and pretty pleasing it that Alito recuse. In point of fact, Joe Biden and Democratic House and Senate candidates should be running not just against Trump or against Republicans per se, but running against the goddamned theocratic Supreme Court. And if Durbin doesn't want to do anything about Alito, he damn well better resign his chairmanship of Senate Judiciary and put somebody in there who will take the obvious softball and hit this over the effing fence. Okay, coming down the stretch here, back to Bloomberg's Joshua Green, quoting again. Recently, the liberal group Priorities USA asked 1,500 likely voters across 8 battleground states to rank more than 24 Trump statements or policies from most to least concerning. Yeah, do I have to write least? Can they all be most? In results not publicly released until now, Priorities found that Trump's dictator comment and calls to gut the Constitution ranked as the most concerning of all the options. As I said before, Mr. Green's wide-eyedness seems less goofy or dumb and more like he was cleverly trying to get this article past terrified editors at Bloomberg. And with good reason, because the real lesson in it is that Republican pollsters are seeing Republican voters recoiling from Trump. Green quotes an unaffiliated Republican pollster who asked not to be identified because he didn't want to anger the Trump campaign. Quote, that's kind of the bet that the Biden campaign is making, that eventually people are going to become so frightened about what the next Trump turn will mean that they'll move over to Biden. The rest of the piece is about how repealing the presidential term limits contained in the 22nd Amendment would be nearly impossible. There is a dismissive quote from Steve Bannon saying they're just talking about this to own the libs. Presumably just like Bannon was talking about putting the heads of Dr. Fauci and Christopher Wray on pikes just to troll Dr. Fauci and troll FBI Director Wray and troll fans of the French Revolution. Just kidding. The point, of course, is not that the 22nd Amendment would be repealed. It would be that it would be ignored. Trump, sometime in 2025, 6, 7, 8, whenever he felt like it, would declare he's running in 2028. Try and stop me. Somebody would sue him. And his defense would be that the 22nd Amendment doesn't say a goddamn thing specifically about the Grover Clevelands of the presidential universe. This issue, again, completely fabricated like presidential immunity, or like some sort of magic eraser that takes care of the 14th Amendment and makes him eligible. This would go to the Supreme Court, which Trump owns. And the Trump-owned Supreme Court would erase the 22nd Amendment, as it has, you may recall, recently erased the 14th Amendment. Ooh, libs? When we said own libs, we meant it literally. We own you now. One last Bloomberg quote. The possibility that Trump might try to abolish term limits if reelected in November registers as a serious threat to a meaningful share of voters, despite his claim to the contrary. And it appears to be driving them toward Biden. In an April 21st NBC News Public Opinion Strategies poll, 16% of registered voters named threats to democracy as the most important issue facing the country. Among them, Biden held a 67-point lead over Trump, 81% to 14%. McCammon, the Wisconsin woman who once voted for Trump, now counts herself as part of this group. Quote, I will vote for Biden even if he is in a coma, she says. Grandma Lori, you have unsuspected depth. I cannot recommend this piece too highly to you, or to Joe Biden, or to Jen Dylan O'Malley, Dillon, to the campaign manager. Bloomberg's Joshua Green tweeted this out with a gift link, so I sent it to my contacts at the Biden campaign since it won't cost them anything. Now, reading this, it would seem that the play is pretty obvious from here on in. Run that piece from the American Conservative magazine about third terms and how Trump should get one as a campaign ad. Just quote it. Run every single Trump comment about staying in office as a campaign ad. Run the ones where he's joking and say, is he joking? Run the ones where he's not joking and say, he's not joking. You have a seam of new votes here. You have the Comstock load of new votes here. And like I said, also run ads against the Supreme Court as well, especially that scenario in which Trump urinates on the Constitution, the part about only serving 2 terms, and Alito applauds. If any more indication is required here, the Washington Post was nice enough to underscore yesterday that the New York Times Siena poll last week, with all the bad Biden numbers in the swing states, actually has potentially really good news in it. Quote, a generic Democratic Senate candidate led a generic Republican by 5 points. But Biden trailed Trump by 6 points. That's an 11-point gap between Democratic Senate candidates and the president. We've also seen big gaps when you ask about actual Senate candidates. The Times Siena poll in Nevada showed Senator Jackie Rosen doing 14 points better than Biden on the margins, i.e. Rosen ahead by 2, but Biden trailing by 12. Representative Ruben Gallego did 11 points better in Arizona. Senator Bob Casey did 8 points better in Pennsylvania. And Senator Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin did 7 points better. A new CBS News YouGov poll in Arizona released over the weekend showed an even bigger gap. Gallego led Republican Kari Lake by 13 points, even as Biden trailed Trump by 5, a whopping 18-point difference. One way to look at this, wrote the Post, is that those votes are gettable for Biden. Another is that he's uniquely unpalatable to voters otherwise supportive of Democrats. Right. I'm voting for Tammy Baldwin, but not Joe Biden. I'm voting for Ruben Gallego and Trump. Of course it's possible. Of course, those combinations must explain some of those numbers, but they don't explain all of those numbers, and I would put a bet down that they don't explain a majority of those numbers. The first point from the Post is the key. One way to look at this is that those votes are gettable for Biden. You think? But if only they had a great new punchline for new campaign ads in Wisconsin for Tammy Baldwin and Joe Biden, like, ooh, hi, I'm Grandma Lori McCammon, and I'm a Wisconsin grandma from Wisconsin, and I'm a grandma, and I voted for Trump, and then I found out he wants to stop having elections and be president till he's 206. So this year, I'll be voting for Joe Biden, even if he's in a coma. Then there's a pause, and then you hear Joe Biden say, I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message because, guess what? I'm also not in a coma. Okay, from the Trump trial here in New York, the defense rests, which, given the presence of drowsy Don, torpid Trump, daydreaming Donald, the comatose comb-over, the defense rests is meant literally. Closing arguments begin next Tuesday, and then we'll see. It's impossible to tell what the jury saw compared to what we saw. What we saw was Trump's witness pissing off the judge, enough for the judge to clear the courtroom Monday, and for then the defendant's key witness, the same guy, getting blown up by the prosecution yesterday. And then they take a week off. And we also got to see Trump concluding that everybody in the world agrees with him.
Every single legal expert, Andy McCarthy, Jonathan
That's right. There are only 4 legal experts in the entire world. Jonathan Turley, McLovin, somebody else, and Levin. Mark Levin, whose name is actually Mark Levin, but don't tell Trump because Trump may have narcolepsy. The jury also does not get to see all the idiots who form the Trump posse every day. Remember that great joke I did yesterday about grabbing them by the Lieutenant General Dan Patrick, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, the guy who promised to die of COVID to protect his grandchildren's economy in Texas and then reneged, spoke to the crowd. Sebastian Gorka, who owns Nazi-adjacent tunics and was the perfect guy to have in front of cameras the day Trump reposted a fan video with all kinds of Nazi headlines over his picture, including the headline, Unified Reich. He was there. Dr. Ronnie Jackson, because there might have been beverage service. And, of course, funny man Joe Piscopo, I guess because Kid Rock was still sleeping off the Rolling Stone interview. Joe Piscopo, incredibly, 40 years and 10 days ago, today, was Joe Piscopo's last day on Saturday Night Live. And I must say, I can't shake my fondness for him. He was very good on it. First of all, he did a sportscaster based on my friend Warner Wolf from Channel 2 in New York, who just screamed everything and asked questions. Nothing else but questions. What does this mean? What is it going to tell? Who says this? Who dropped that ball? Who cares? Joe Piscopo Live, Saturday Night Sports. Loved it. He did a great Frank Sinatra. He did Frank Sinatra singing the theme from the Flintstones. Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. And he told what I thought was the greatest joke I ever heard about Frank Sinatra. After he became somewhat famous for doing this Frank Sinatra routine, Joe Piscopo says he took Frank Sinatra, or took his mother to a Frank Sinatra concert in New Jersey. And in the middle of it, as Frank was singing, Frank suddenly recognized him from the stage. Someday when I'm awfully low, and stopped and pointed at Joe Piscopo and said, "You out." Joe Piscopo for a while sat behind me. He was in the second row at Yankee Stadium behind the plate. I was in the first row. This is 10 years ago, so it's 30 years after he told that joke. And I told him one day, I still remembered it word for word. That's how good of a joke it was. But I really needed to know, did it actually happen? Did he actually take his mother to a Frank Sinatra concert after portraying Frank Sinatra singing the Flintstones on national television back when Saturday Night Live was, supposed to be funny and people over the age of 7 years old watched it? Did it happen? And honest to God, his answer was, he didn't remember. He didn't remember the joke. And if you don't remember the joke, or you don't remember what the truth was, whether or not it actually happened, the correct answer is one of two things. You say, of course it happened. I couldn't have made up anything that funny. Or, of course it didn't happen. I'm a comedian. I wrote that. You out. But what do you want? Joe Piscopo thinks Trump is worth supporting. And 40 years after his last big gig ended, 40 years of Saturday Night Live and 17,000 different cast members ago, Trump thought he was the right guy to bring down as part of his posse. You out. Also of interest here, I may do the Unified Reich video story tomorrow with some context depending on events. Frankly, I don't think it's as big a deal as everybody else does because, as mentioned a couple of times here, Trump's a Nazi and an anti-Semite. Why is this a surprise? We have it on the record since 1990 that he owned a copy of Hitler's speeches and kept it in a little nightstand near his bed, according to his wife. The one who's now in the, now in the golf course. We'll see. For now, of interest here, anybody remember who was hosting Fox's 8 p.m. news hour 13 months ago tonight? The answer is not Joe Piscopo, Saturday Night Live Sports. It's the same guy who will now be hosting a show on Rossiya 24, Russian state TV. And you thought I've worked for a lot of networks. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
Still ahead of us on this edition of Countdown. I told this story yesterday to a friend, and I want to tell it again. The morning disc jockey who threatened to kill me 1 hour and then wanted to give me a multi-year contract 1 hour later, who came to me and said, "Young man," I was a young man then, "you punk." Things I promised not to tell coming up, but first, as ever, there are still more new idiots to talk about. The daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. You out. The bronze, worse, good old Marco Rubio, the senior idiot senator from Florida, the one who threatened to have me prosecuted for demanding we reform the Supreme Court because Marco Rubio has the IQ of a chair. A chair that has one leg shorter than the others. Well, he may have topped himself, or he may just be maintaining the standards he has honed over the years. Marco Rubio on Fox, quote, news, unquote, "There is only one person that would ever face charges like this, and it has to have the last name Donald Trump." No, see, Marco, while you get some water, last name, it means the there's a Christian name, and then there's the cert. Okay, never mind. It's like trying to explain something to a chair. The runner-up worser, speaking of which, Chris Cillizza is back, days after posting his hilarious mission statement. Chris seemed to confirm that he only spends about an hour a day here on this plane of existence in the America of 2024. He is shocked to discover that people are diagnosing cognitive declines in presidential candidates. When the GOP consultant Stuart Stevens went on MSNBC and said Trump has dementia, Cillizza retweeted the clip and added, "This is absolutely ridiculous. You can hate Trump, you can believe him unfit for office, I definitely think the latter, but diagnosing him from afar with something as serious as dementia, it's just deeply irresponsible." Now, you know what's deeply irresponsible, Chris? Both sidesing every goddamned thing while the country burns to the ground, and you're the last thing to go up in flames, and you say, "Well, at least I didn't take sides against the fire. I treated the fire fairly." George Conway kind of felt the same thing I did. He came back with, "No, it's not. Numerous mental health professionals have been watching him carefully and have come to the conclusion that he is cognitively deteriorating." Well, Mr. Mission Statement would not cede, would not ask anybody. One of them has actually seen him in person. No way you should be diagnosing dementia from afar. No way. I have terrible news for Chris on two fronts. Three, actually. First one being, Chris, you're an idiot. Two, starting in 2015, maybe earlier, Donald Trump has diagnosed everybody he's met with mental illness. The number is well into 3 figures, maybe 4 figures, maybe 5 figures by now, of people he has called all kinds of diseases and pejorative names for mentally impaired in some way or cognitively impaired in some way. So if you're trying to stop people from diagnosing others afar, you're literally 9 years too late. He diagnoses Biden every day. Biden, the president of the United States, Joe Biden, No, Joe Biden's president of the United States, Chris. So the ship sailed, and it's already made its way around the world 37 times. Chris evidently did not know this. But more importantly, how do you think, Chris, that they diagnose dementia? A blood test? An X-ray? Professionals observe behavior? They often ask the patient, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they ask relatives and those around the patient, but whoever they ask, it's still all from afar. You cannot get into somebody's head and measure their neural synapses. And even more importantly, remember those Ciliza Washington Post Hillary Clinton email headlines I quoted last week from his 50 articles about the topic in just 6 months of 2015? Several of them refer to, quote, Hillary Clinton's honesty problem. One said Hillary Clinton as honest and trustworthy as Donald Trump. Well, the marriage of the words honest and problem suggests, well, a problem, a clinical problem, which Chris Ciliza was diagnosing from afar. So what he's really saying here to Stuart Stevens and George Conway and everybody else in the world is, you can't diagnose anybody's psychological or cognitive problems from afar, but I can. But our winner, let me just quote Newsweek.com, conservative TV host Tucker Carlson has launched his own show on a Russian state television channel. He decided to go to One America News? Oh, no, I must have misunderstood. The former Fox News anchor is presenting the program Tucker on the rolling news channel Russia 24, and we know where they're rolling it over. With the first episode now available online, Russian state newspaper Rossiyskaya Gazeta reported. The paper said that the show is part of a joint project with Carlson TV, in which he will interview figures and politicians who have alternative views to the mainstream. In other words, liars. Well, it turns out Newsweek is partially incorrect here. This is not going to be some new series, at least not yet. It's just going to be the videos that he's already posted to Twitter X, only with subtitles. Which raises this question, why would they need subtitles? I mean, everything Tucker Carlson says was written originally in Russia, wasn't it? Tucker, as the old joke goes, it loses something in the original Carlson. Today's worst person in the world, Tavares.
I'm Dave Spencer, WNEW News.
And now, WNEW Sports and Commentary with John Kenley.
And good morning, Keith Olbermann for Big John. Sports is brought to you by Amtrak. America is getting into training with Metroliner service 13 times every business day to Philadelphia. They run from Penn Station, and if you were there last night, you probably heard some noise from upstairs. It was Ranger fans celebrating the new year a little early.
This remains, in short, as terrifying as anything else in my career. Death threats, fake anthrax, what New York felt like post 9/11, the frozen feeling of realizing you've made a terrible, damaging mistake on a story, even working for Rupert Murdoch. Worse than that. 42 years have passed since this event, and nothing has dimmed the memory. Nothing has reduced the palpable sense of anxiety in every joint in my body. On Sunday, December 21st, 1980, the Oakland Raiders defeated the New York Giants 33-17 to end the Giants season at 4 wins and 12 losses, with the most points they had given up in 1 year since 1966. I was the backup sportscaster at WNEW Radio in New York. We carried the Giants game broadcasts. In fact, we had carried them since I was 2 years old. I was now a month shy of 22. And it being Christmas week, I reported bright and early to the studios at 41st Street and 3rd Avenue on Monday, December 22nd. My first sportscast was at 5:30 a.m. There was a theme song, which invoked the name of the regular sportscaster John Kennelly. It said sports and commentary, and my first few weeks filling in that year, I stuck mostly to the sports with just an occasional commentary, but mostly a joke or pithy observation. Well, kind of pithy. But that first weekend of winter, the Giants' stink was all that we could smell in New York, and I felt I had to point it out, pointedly. And so while I observed that there was a positive, they had started 1-8, but then had actually won 3 of their last 7 games, the rest of my commentary was cynical, acerbic, dissatisfied. In other words, the average day of the typical New York sports fan. I ended my show right on time at 5:35 a.m., and to my surprise, I heard the disc jockey skip his usual post-sportscast remarks and instead simply play the next record, which I think was Frank Sinatra's The Way You Look Tonight. We were a big band station. I stepped out of the booth and took the dozen strides through the newsroom, busy even at that hour with 8 or 10 staffers, and I was sitting down at my desk when the door from the main air studio slammed open. In the doorway stood the disc jockey, and he had a message for me. The message was, "You punk!" The disc jockey's name was Ted Brown. On the air, he was your morning man, Ted Brown, speaking upbeat drivel, mostly to women who loved the mellow sound of his voice. Off the air, WNEW was his station, and the morning show was his show. He would fight for it. In fact, he had fought at least 2 news reporters in his time, in the studio, while Frank Sinatra records played on a turntable 30 feet away. Ted Brown was a big man, 6'3", 6'4", maybe. By this point, I don't know, 230, 40, 250, thick tortoiseshell glasses. He was a sports fan, a huge gambler, racetracks mostly. The Giants had begun on WNEW in 1961. Ted Brown had begun on WNEW in 1949. And he was tough. And it was not even the New York tough I had grown up with. This guy had been a tail gunner on a B-17 during the Second World War, and the Nazis shot him down, and they took him to Stalag 9C near Leipzig, and they kept him there for 18 months, and basically he chewed up and spit out guys like me for breakfast. And I respected him. "You punk! So you don't like how the Giants did. You think any of us do?" He gestured towards the newscasters and staffers. Nobody looked up. "You know how easy it is to sit there in a nice, heated, dry, comfortable newsroom? I was in Stalag 9C!" His contempt for the idea of the newsroom was amazing. "You sit here in your newsroom and pontificate while men in helmets with mud on them, their bones breaking, their hearts pounding, they are out on the field fighting and tackling and working on the field of battle. So you can sit here in your newsroom." It was at this point that I remembered where I had first seen a photograph of Ted Brown. He was in a booth at Yankee Stadium, where the Giants played in the 1960s. He was the third man, a combination color announcer and host, on Giants radio broadcasts on WNEW. He was the worst possible person to have heard me rip the New York Giants, even the 4-12 1980 New York Giants, even if editorially I was completely correct and not nearly as hard on the team as its own announcers had been on our station the day before. "What did you do to earn your spot here, punk?" Ted Brown was turning red. One of his fists was already clenched, while the other arm cut through the air to emphasize how much I sucked. I truly believed he was about to take a swing at me. Then from behind him, the door from his studio swung open again, and the elderly engineer, the man who actually spun the records on Ted's show, came through it. "Ted, I just had to segue out of Sinatra to Jimmy Cagney singing Yankee Doodle Dandy, and the general manager called and he said, 'I should tell you, WNEW does not segue no records. Don't do it again. You better get back in here. The Cagney's almost finished.'" The engineer then vanished silently back through the door. This warning did nothing but make Ted Brown even angrier. "The general manager! Have you met the general manager, punk? Jack Thayer. And Jack Thayer gets in here at 8:20 every morning on the dot. Clockwork, punk. When you finish your 8:30 sportscast, I'm dragging you in to meet Jack Thayer, the general manager. And that, punk, is when your career at WNEW Radio will come to an abrupt end. You think the New York Giants had a bad 1980? How about your 1980, punk, when your career ended? Because the real men are out there on the playing field, not sitting inside a newsroom in a sweater. This continued for some time. The engineer returned. Ted, it's Thayer again. I just segued to some Mel Torme. Ted, Thayer wants to talk to you. He thinks maybe you're not here and I'm covering for you. Ted Brown turned and swore dark oaths against the engineer and, for that matter, against the general manager, Jack Thayer, and, for that matter, against Mel Torme. You and me, punk! 8:35! The end of your career, punk! He lunged at me suddenly. The engineer grabbed him and pulled him back through the door. In the newsroom, there were only two sounds. One, my heart, which I suspect was audible, perhaps the next block. The other, typing. Nobody said a word. Nobody looked at me. A phone rang. The production assistant sang out, WNEW News. I went over to the newscaster who had been the most supportive of me to that point, Bob Hagan. And through my shaking, I said, thanks for the help, Bob. Bob did not look up from his typewriter. What? He said matter-of-factly. Brown? I said, yes, Brown. He's going to get me fired in 3 hours. Bob Hagan laughed. No, he's not. I said, he just spent, I don't know how many minutes. He spent 3 records screaming at me. Didn't you hear him? I heard him. We all heard him. We've all heard him every time he said that. He said that to every one of us out here. He said that about every one of us out here. He took a swing at Eisgrau over there. What was it, Jimmy, 2 months ago? Ignore him. I said I failed to see why any of what he had told me should encourage me to ignore Ted Brown when we had a meeting with the general manager at 8:35. Bob Hagan now stopped typing and smiled up at me, reassuringly, from his chair. Keith, you do a good job. Ted is nuts. Ted is mean. Ted is a crazy Giants fan. Ted is also still bitter that he's not on the radio broadcast of the Giants games. But Ted has also been doing morning radio almost every day since 1945. Keith, that's 35 years of getting up in the middle of the night. And many, many years ago, Keith, Ted stopped remembering things. Like what somebody said on his show. He doesn't remember. He won't remember. Just finish off the next sportscast with one of your clever, funny little kicker stories. And even if he somehow remembers what you said about the Giants, when he hears a good laugh, all he'll remember is the laugh. I tried to be respectful of Bob, but I told him I found all of this hard to believe. Keith, he also drinks. He has nightmares. He has POW nightmares. And he gets up at 3 a.m. every day. He does not imprint new memories anymore. But no, why should you listen to me? I've only been on his show for 10 years. Why would I know? I'm telling you, get a good, funny kicker for the 6:30 and he'll love you. I nodded grimly. I did not believe Bob Hagan, but I knew he meant well. And anyway, he had started to type again. The clock now moved impossibly quickly. Incredibly, I did find just the kind of funny, clever kicker story Bob suggested I should use to close the 6:30 sportscast. I minimized my assault on the Giants and then finished off my report with some story that shed a good light on Montclair State College in New Jersey. I could not have known, and I swear I did not know, that Ted Brown's sister had graduated from Montclair State College in New Jersey. I finished off the sportscast with the story, something that made Montclair State look good, a little chuckle, and then Keith Olbermann for John Kennelly on the Ted Brown Show. Ominously, again to my terror, Ted Brown now said nothing on the air. I could not see him through the window into the main air studio. The engineer played a record instead. It may have been the Mantovani Strings Play the Beatles. I opened the door back to the newsroom slowly and with trepidation. I crouched as I moved back towards my desk, and that's when it happened. The door from the main air studio slammed open again. It was Ted Brown again. Where is he? Where is he? Montclair State? My sister went to Montclair State. What a story. What a great laugh. Perfectly delivered. My God, that was the best sportscast we have ever had on this station. Don't you think so, Preely? God love you, kid. What a talent. I laughed out loud. Kid, I don't laugh out loud. It was the same Ted Brown. I stole a quick glance at the newsroom to see if this whole thing was some kind of act being filmed for a hidden camera TV series. Nobody looked up. Again, nobody looked up. Ted Brown, the man who an hour before was ready to beat me up and get me fired, was now repeating again and again that I had just delivered the best sportscast in the history of WNEW radio. That's when his engineer came back in. He had segued from Mantovani to Perry Como, and the general manager had called, and now Ted Brown's eyes widened behind the thick glasses. The general manager, Jack Thayer, say, Keith, have you ever met Jack Thayer? This gives me a great idea. Jack Thayer comes in here every morning at 8:20, like clockwork. Look, I love John Kennelly. He's great, but you are exactly the kind of new, fresh young voice we need on this radio station. Damn it, that I need on my show. When Jack Thayer comes in here at 8:20 this morning, you and I are going right into his office, and we're going to get you your own sportscast on my show. We can do 2 sportscasts an hour. We'll take it out of the stock report. Montclair State, I'll get you a contract. You and Kennelly, will $75,000 be enough for you, kid? You're going to hit the big time here, my friend. And out the engineer came again. Jack Thayer had again called in, 4th time that I knew of. He really needed Ted back in the studio to talk to the women. Ted Brown happily shouted, "Okay, okay," and began to back up into the doorway. The look in his eyes towards me was one of unimaginable love. Come here, wait, come here. And he lunged at me and grabbed me into a bear hug. Just brilliant. Montclair State, I got to call my sister and tell you, see you in Jack's office at 8:35. I stood there, having now been pummeled by 2 hurricanes arriving from different directions in the span of 1 hour. All was silent in the WNEW newsroom again, but for the typing. But it was silent only for a moment. That's when Bob Hagan addressed me. Again, he did not look up. All he said was, "Keith, he won't remember that either."
Finally, they call it disastroturf, and the closer and closer we get to game day, the more and more likely it is the Giants won't get to practice on it. As the steady rains continue in the Bay Area, the 49ers continue to suggest that the Giants cancel their scheduled Saturday practice at Candlestick Park for the good of the bad field, which means that the first time folks like Rob Carpenter will get their feet wet, literally, will be when they come out for the game Sunday afternoon. That's sports, brought to you by Amtrak. America's getting into training with Metroliner service 13 times every business day to Philadelphia. I'm Keith Olbermann for John Kennelly on The Ted Brown Show.
On WNEW.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Keith. It's 21 before 7. And
I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. Countdown musical directors Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Ray was on guitars, bass, and drums. Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards, and it was produced by TKO Brothers. Other music, including some of the Beethoven, arranged and performed by No Horns Allowed. The sports music, the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, was written by Mitch Warren Davis. It's courtesy of ESPN Inc. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever. My announcer today was my friend Jonathan Banks. Everything else was pretty much my fault. Let's count down for this, the 168th day until the 2024 presidential election, the 1,233rd day since dictator J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the legal system, use the mental health system. Use presidential immunity if it happens. Use the not regularly given elector objection option. Use the new article in Bloomberg to stop him from doing it again while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is tomorrow, still day-to-day with the sinus. 75-25 tomorrow. Till the next one, whenever it is, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.